I've been doing a fair number of interviews lately about Canada's LNG capacity, export capacity, and the potential for exporting to Asia. It's a very controversial topic in Canada and one that sucks up a lot of the oxygen in the Canadian energy conversation. Well, I'm going to be talking to Cynthia Leach, who's the Assistant Chief Economist at RBC and one of the co-authors of Canada's Conundrum, 3 Ways to Address the World's Gas and Climate Crises. So welcome to the interview, Cynthia.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I mentioned this to you off camera, and I'll just throw it out there because I think most of my viewers will know this already. I'm an LNG skeptic, but always open to be convinced by a good evidence-based argument. So let's talk about that argument. What are some of the assumptions behind recommendations to build out liquefied natural gas exports, especially on the West Coast? What are some of the assumptions? I'll let you take a crack at it.
Absolutely. First, I should say our report was more about raising awareness of the choices before Canada. So I wouldn't say that we're proposing one path forward, but illuminating in our report, hopefully, that these are the options for Canada, that they each have very real trade-offs that Canada needs to consider and manage, but that the window for making those decisions and deciding whether or not to play a bigger role in global LNG markets is closing soon. So it's something we're going to have to do. But I can certainly talk about what some of Canada's advantages are in terms of LNG exports from the West Coast. First of all, I think maybe a setting, for people who might not be as up to speed in terms of advantages of LNG, whether it's Canada or otherwise, I think it's twofold. First of all, in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, concerns around energy security and the diversity of stable energy supplies has put LNG in the spotlight. And number two, in terms of decarbonization and reducing emissions from our economies, natural gas is a cleaner burning fuel compared to coal. So this is a big argument for using it in Asia, because with a growing population and in many countries more price sensitive, coal is often the default fuel. And so natural gas provides an emission savings, even when you consider the life cycle. Even when you consider, for example, the life cycle emissions of producing it in Canada, liquefying it in Canada, and then shipping it to Asia. So those are two kind of global advantages of LNG. So what is Canada's advantage from the West Coast? I think it's 4 things. One is we are a different supplier. We have limited, one LNG kind of terminal coming online mid-decade. The US has been going, quite assertively in building new terminals. And as countries look at diverse supplies, they're not just looking at, switching from Russia to the US. It's about diversity, and Canada can offer that as a stable country. With the second point, very plentiful upstream natural gas supplies. And so the Montney Shale Basin, for example, in BC and Alberta, is a very large shale gas play. And it is very cheap to extract and on par with, for example, some of the basins that you see in the United States. And that's important because natural gas's role as a transition fuel is going to depend on it being affordable. Another thing is we have better green credentials here in terms of producing that natural gas. So Canada has world-leading methane regulations. They're going to be getting stricter. The Montney Basin itself has lower formation carbon dioxide within it, which improves its profile. And to the fourth point, but also as an emissions point, we have lower shipping times to Asia compared to, for example, even the Gulf Coast, which has to go through the Panama Canal. That saves both cost and emissions. And so that's really, the case for Canadian LNG. That was the case a decade ago, in many cases, when we were looking at supplying global markets with a lot of projects on the West Coast, but some of those have become more important given developments over the last couple of years. And not to say they're not challenges, but those are the core arguments in favor.
And I'm really glad that you clarified that the report is setting out the choices as opposed to advocating for one of those choices. So thank you very much for that. I was maybe reading my own biases, reading with my own biases on full display. when I was doing that. But I want to talk about some of the data. So I went and I found, and you can find this in the IEA reports, you can find it in BP's energy forecast, annual energy forecast, but I picked one from S&P Global Commodity Insights, a big forecaster, big analyst. And I'm looking at the installed capacity for power generation in China out to 2050. And huge growth from 2,000 megawatts of capacity out to about 7,000. And what do we see? Wind and solar taking almost all of that growth. And S&P is saying the same thing that the IEA and others are, which is that LNG imports or LNG consumption in China's power sector will peak in 2030 and gently decline to pretty much nothing by 2050. And, and I hear this all the time, China, 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 and China is going in a different direction. It doesn't seem like our ambitions around LNG are lined up with the biggest customer that we would try to go after.
This is a great discussion, a great point. So I think there's a couple things. First of all, it's not just China. There's a lot of Asian countries there, Japan, Korea, but also of the South Pacific that would, are looking at, and maybe not China, but some other countries are looking at strong population growth, moving up the income distribution, which means more energy intensity, and the need also to balance renewables in the system. So just like in North America, we could build a lot of renewables, but you're dealing with intermittency of solar and wind resources, and so you need to balance that with nuclear or hydro. And gas has actually been, in Canada, even like the peak load management, and it's not clear how that would be replaced exactly in some of these other countries in Asia that also, as I said before, are more price sensitive. And so if you're looking at expensive battery storage, that might be more of an abatement or decarbonization pathway for Canada, but less clear about Asia. To be clear, solar and wind are more compelling in Asia than they used to be. The costs that have come down have in some jurisdictions put it more on par with gas, especially given the run up over the last year and a half in gas prices. But I think the core point is, you can look at one forecast or another, and they're all good assessments of what, good guesses of what might happen in the future. And it is true that in a net zero consistent scenario, we need to see less natural gas globally. But if we don't have those stable, secure energy supplies in the interim, it will derail the transition that, getting to net zero by 2050. And so the thing is, should Canada have some role in, providing that global energy security while the world transitions away from fossil fuels?
Well, that brings us to LNG supply, because one of the things that's coming online in the mid, just a couple of years, mid-decade, is literally a tsunami of supply from countries like Qatar and USA and Australia and others. And once again, Canada is jockeying to be, how can we be 12th in the world in a 20th century energy source? Not how can we be leading the world in geothermal or wind, or the combination of combining wind and solar with hydro like we could do in Western Canada. We're not having those discussions. We're having discussions from the 1980s, the 1990s. How do we jump on board that energy source? And why wouldn't we invest in 30 to 50 year infrastructure just at the time when the world is going through this huge energy transition and moving over to electricity, and it just seems like, I'm sorry, it's not a compelling argument. And it's, we would be a marginal producer at best from everything I can see. And by the way, I've interviewed economists who say that, if you're building a plant in the west coast of Canada, your capital costs are 2 times that of the US Gulf Coast. You've got lower operating costs because you're further north and it's colder, and that improves your liquefaction efficiency, those kinds of things, and you're closer to Asia. But, twice your capital costs, and we just found out that the Coastal GasLink pipeline that's going to supply LNG Canada is now $30 billion instead of $10 billion.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, a couple.
Okay, so anyway,
Sorry.
to wrap up my little rant, the variables that argue against building out Canadian LNG capacity seem to me to be far more basically overwhelming those in favor of, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, a couple points there, and then what I make of the whole thing and how I kind of square it for myself. You're absolutely right about capital costs. For greenfield development, that's where our challenge is. We've got challenging terrain. We have difficulty getting projects approved. In the new suite of projects, globally, there are a ton, but some of those face challenges, and traditionally lower cost suppliers like Australia, Australia's not quite a lower cost supplier anymore, but US, others are starting to face some of that limits of low cost development. And so on a relative competitiveness, we might be looking a little bit better, but it is no question that Canada is more of a premium product. And there is a question whether global consumers will pay for that premium product. The second thing is, people are moving quickly. So that goes kind of to our clarion call of the paper is Canada needs to decide and get moving one way or the other. But in terms of how I square the challenges goes, the other challenge I wanted to mention is if we build an economy just reliant on fossil fuels, that exposes us to huge transition risk. Even if natural gas might have better, by a lot of assessments, prospects than, oil sands, for example, could be a bit of a hedge in that space, and no doubt a huge source of economic value, it's still a risk to the Canadian economy. But how I think about it is, it's not for me as an economist looking at all these numbers to make the business case for a natural gas project here or there. The question for me is, are there kind of no regrets type of actions or things missing in the policy framework or the industry playbook that means Canada can't compete at all? Because we don't necessarily need to be number one and build 15 projects that we were looking at a decade ago. A couple of projects can generate tremendous value and count as Canada contributing to its allies' global energy security. So to me, there are a couple of things missing in the framework that prevent us from taking advantage of that. And I can go through a few of them. One is Article 6. There's a global mechanism to trade carbon credits. The idea that if natural gas shipped to Asia from Canada can reduce global emissions, but raise Canada's emissions, how does Canada get a credit for that? Canada can work on forging those bilateral agreements that would allow us to obtain credit for that.
I'm going to have to jump in here because
Yeah.
I'm one of the few energy journalists in Canada that has actually followed up on that story, and I've interviewed carbon consultants, international carbon consultants, who said that's not the way Article 6 was intended to work. And secondly, I've interviewed the offices of both ministers Jonathan Wilkinson, Natural Resources, and Stephen Guilbeault, who's Minister of Economy. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants, none of the Canadian government wants no part of trying to get to negotiate agreements under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and for carbon credits for avoided emissions in Asia or any place else. The headwinds are just against it. And this argument that this can be done, because the Premier of Alberta makes it all the time, and you see others in the industry make it all the time. It would be so hard to do under Article 6, under the accounting mechanism, that nobody would even bother to do it. And secondly, the federal government wants no part of it. So I think we need to put a pin in that cushion and stop making that argument, is my point.
Well, I'm not sure it's been run to ground totally. And we definitely have new context with the Japanese and German consumers looking for stable supplies. The point is, it's not something that businesses can do. It's something that the government needs to look at. And so if that's the view, then I think that needs to be better articulated, because to me, it still looks like a missing piece. That means that Canada can't really get to the next level of the LNG conversation and make that decision because some of these simple things aren't in place. Not simple, but important things are not in place.
Yes, fair enough. Okay, and maybe the government, but you can see from the political take on this from the ministers is, if we come out and say it explicitly, like they did to me, then what happens is it's a firestorm of political backlash in places like Alberta, and they're just trying to avoid that kind of thing. Okay, that was number one, and I think you had another reason or two, so I'll let you talk about those.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple other things. Project approvals have been a challenge, and this is not just for LNG and fossil fuel infrastructure, it's for other things. The government's committed a lot of money in the last couple budgetary documents to improving project approvals, federal government, and working with the provinces, and they're supposed to have a plan out by the end of the year. We need to see what that looks like. and industry needs to, and Indigenous communities need to be involved in that. That's something that Canada across the board needs to be better at. And again, is a piece of the policy framework that we need to improve upon that's going to have an influence on LNG and other sectors. There's also things that industry can do in terms of cost management, in terms of the government providing more forward-looking targets on decarbonization. We know from the emissions reduction plan what the federal government is looking for in emissions cuts from oil and gas by 2030. But we don't have the oil and gas emissions cap. We don't know when that's coming, as last time I checked. And that needs to be clear, because that helps guide those LNG investments and determine on what timeline and if they're profitable. And electrification. We can decarbonize a lot of natural gas production upstream and at the liquefaction level. It requires a lot of electricity. And for a jurisdiction, for example, like BC, that involves trade-offs potentially with other, green production. And so BC Hydro, which is being called upon, as in other jurisdictions to lead this, needs to provide a clear electrification strategy. Without those pieces, it's too hard for businesses to make the decisions. And so I think that's where Canada, at least in a no regrets basis, can focus on those areas, and beyond that has to make a more decisive decision on whether it will play in global LNG markets.
Okay, let's address some of the issues you raised. To my understanding, if I'm running my number correctly, is there are 18 LNG projects that are already been approved and they've got their environmental certificate, and they're waiting for an FID, a final investment decision. 18 of them. So my take on this is that money talks, and in this case, the money, the smart money is saying goodbye, Canada, because LNG, now granted, LNG Canada, Shell and its partners invested $40 billion to build out that phase one of that project. And I can't tell you how many months I've been reading oil and gas analysts saying, ooh, it looks like Shell's getting ready to do the FID on phase two. It'll be next week. It'll be next month. And here we are in June of 2023, and we still don't have an investment. So, I think, as I said, money talks, and the message, the conversation it's having with us is not very positive. Now, some of these other issues that you've raised is, look at what's happening down in the US around linear infrastructure. They can't build anything either. There was a study that came out of the Canadian LNG Research Institute in 2019, I think it was, and I interviewed the economist who did it, and they, the length of time to approve energy infrastructure projects in Canada and the US is very similar. The thing that makes Canada take a little bit longer is we have to do Aboriginal consultations, Indigenous consultations, which in the Constitution, it's not in the American Constitution. They don't have to do that. And so they're a little faster than us. But building linear infrastructure everywhere is really difficult, not just in Canada. So I'm not sure that there are a lot of efficiencies or time savings to be squeezed out of that process, frankly. And I don't know, we could have this, I don't know where to go from here, Cynthia, because the issues that we've discussed today still don't present a good evidence-based argument for Canada building out LNG export capacity. I know you didn't come on here to argue one side or the other, but just to alert us to the choices that we have to make. And I would say that we've already made the choice. The fact that we've done nothing, we haven't got any more FIDs, and probably how long do you think the window is still open? That somebody has to make a choice here. We've got 2 years, 5 years. What have we got?
Yeah, I mean, I don't make these decisions myself, so I'm not sure. But I think Canada needs to. The point is, my argument is, it won't be compelling one way or the other unless we can get some of these other things clarified. We need more certainty so private capital can decide whether or not to invest. And it's going to take a little while to build some of those things. So we need to be making a decision now on what we can do on Article 6, on project approvals, on Indigenous equity, for example, and participation, so that there's time. No one exactly knows the lifespan of natural gas in Europe, for example. It's, by the 2030s, it probably looks like it's a lot less, but there are arguments that it may stick around for a while. And the point is, a transition is difficult. So the shelf life might be a bit longer than we think, but the point is, it's not going to be around forever, and we've got to make a decision on this next steps.
An option in there that I didn't see in your paper, and maybe I missed it, but I'm going to put it out here, and you can tell me what you think of it. And that is backfilling the American system. I mean, the Americans are already, the U.S. Energy Information Administration is talking about potential shortages in the U.S. and high prices as the Americans continue to build out their LNG export capacity. And it's been the case before that the Canadian producers, which have an extensive export pipeline network into the U.S. market, have backfilled when there's been price pressure in the U.S. And that is a low cost. I know you don't get the benefits from the capital. We all love the fact that Shell, LNG Canada is spending $40 billion of capital in British Columbia. That's wonderful, and we all enjoy that. But if we're looking for an energy transition strategy while taking advantage of our natural gas resources, then it seems to me backfilling on the American market would be a logical one. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the options in our paper. It's a U.S. energy supplier, and it is happening. There are supply agreements right now with Canadian upstream producers. And remember, part of the LNG boom in the U.S. is, contingent on financing. And a lot of that project financing depends on having offtake agreements, both for the gas and then for the LNG. And, U.S. has pipeline constraints and production issues in some areas, and it's important. It's a role Canada can play, but to basically what you're saying is the core point. It's a low risk, low reward strategy, and it's something that Canada should take advantage of, but not just back into that as the only role that we can play in LNG here. It's not the only one, and so we should make an active decision if we want something else.
Okay, you know what? That's a fair argument, actually, that it should be an active decision, that we shouldn't just do we shouldn't muddle through and have other people make our decisions for us. That I can get on board with. Now, I would say we should actively not pursue LNG, or not in any significant way, but I could see where that your paper laid out the arguments for a more active pro LNG scenario, and that's fair enough. So wrap it up for us, Cynthia. Where are we going with this? Are the conversations taking place to resolve the issues that you're talking about and at least come to a decision?
I'm not as close to it. I would certainly hope so. LNG has certainly gotten a lot of attention the last little bit, and not just within Canada. It's globally. International organizations are acknowledging its role. So it's a bit of a boom, a potential boom right now that, it's important to leverage to inform people about the choices and the trade-offs. I think there's, definitely a receptivity to that energy security argument, the global emissions reductions. And so I think some important groups are taking another look at it. And our point is we just need to move with alacrity in doing so.
Well, look, Cynthia, thank you very much for this. You've come on and you've made compelling arguments for the various positions and laid out the options that Canada has and why we need to move quickly. And I think all of that is good. And I think what we can take away from this conversation is that we need to have a very pointed conversation amongst the stakeholders in this discussion. And we haven't really done that. We kind of skirt it, and the proponents go off and talk amongst them. So I just came back from a gas and LNG conference in Vancouver where I was speaking, and the proponents go off and talk to each other, and the opponents go off and talk to each other. And maybe we need to get all of them together in a room and just hash this out and make some final decisions. But thank you very much for this.
Thanks for having me. It's fun.